Good morning, everyone. I want to preface it by saying that you brought the Wednesday evening political discussion into the Sunday morning meeting and gave me a bully pulpit, so I feel like a man on an island at the moment. So if you remember, in my last Humanist Secular Moment, I went a little bit off topic. And though the reviews are great, today I'm returning to my age-old approach of tying the Humanist Secular Moment to our topic of discussion, which I find compelling. And hopefully my little chat provides fodder and a good kickstart to this morning's discussions. When I started this endeavor, I was determined not to allow any personal biases to outweigh my objectivity. And I'll apologize now if I failed to do so. For today, anyway, you can consider my words to be a mix of a Humanist Secular Moment combined with kind of an opening statement. Fiscal conservative, socially liberal, how do they reconcile? When I first heard it, I was almost confused by the question. So I'd like to take a few moments to review the definitions provided by Joanne. Fiscal conservatism, a political and economic philosophy focused on low taxes, federal or reduced government spending, and free market capitalism. I can't really argue with that thought process or with that definition. For me personally, it's more about reduced government, which leads to reduced government spending. Social liberalism, a political view focused on protecting individual rights, personal freedoms, and social equality. So I know I'm biased, but I always felt that individual rights and personal freedoms were supported by the conservative ideology. Now, I'll admit those ideals for which our current Christian influence conservatism fail miserably. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I interpret social equality to mean equal rights, equal legal standing, and equal opportunity to participate in society, not necessarily equal outcome. And before we go any further, I need to distinguish between the ideas of liberalism and conservatism and the political parties that currently carry those labels. The Republican Party has traditionally identified itself as fiscally conservative. Yet, if fiscal conservatism means lower taxes, reduced government spending, and fiscal restraint, they've missed. The term liberal and conservative have long intellectual traditions that predate today's political parties. So, when I'm using those terms today, I'm talking about philosophies and approaches to government, not a Democrat or Republican, and certainly not about any particular politician. And that's important because in today's political landscape, it's become polarized, and we've become to treat liberal and conservative almost as team names. And once that happens, we stop evaluating individual ideas and we start evaluating which team proposed them. All that said, at first glance, fiscal conservatism and social liberalism might seem to pull us in different directions. But do they really? I often describe myself as fiscally conservative and socially liberal, and I never thought of the two positions as contradictory. Depending on the issue, my viewpoint has capacity to anger either or both sides, and I think humanism gives us a pretty good way to understand why. One of the things I appreciate about humanism, at least at the philosophical level, is it doesn't hand us a political platform or tell us what conclusions we're supposed to reach. That's why I sometimes struggle when I hear HUMTC referred to simply as a progressive organization. I'm reminded of one of my first conversations with Captain Paul, where he stated a problem he saw with humanism is that it doesn't provide social framework. And I agree, it provides more of an individual framework. My own understanding is that humanism provides principles that can inform a societal framework, but not prescribing a particular one. So the 10 commitments of humanism are something I choose to guide my life. They can inspire social actions, but they don't define them. Humanism encourages us to use reason and evidence to question assumptions, to respect individual autonomy and human dignity, and to be willing to reconsider our conclusions when the evidence tells us we should. In other words, humanism doesn't tell us what to think politically. It challenges us to think for ourselves. And that's important because political parties tend to package ideas together. And if we agree with one position, we're often expected to agree with a whole collection of other positions that supposedly go along with it. But why can't we look at each issue on its own merits? Why can't one believe strongly in individual freedom and personal autonomy while also believing that the government should spend public money more carefully and responsibly? I think an important part of that answer is recognized that we're actually asking several different questions. What should an individual be free to do? And what level of responsibility does that individual have for their own circumstances, fortunate and unfortunate? What is the proper role of government? What should government be responsible for, and what should government pay for? Perhaps more importantly, who is going to pay for it? Remember, government doesn't create the resources it spends. Ultimately, these resources come from the economy, from us taxpayers, from businesses, and when the government borrows, future generations. So how we answer those questions will probably influence where we fall on a political spectrum. For example, I can believe that an individual should have the freedom to make a particular personal decision without necessarily believing that the government should be responsible for paying for that decision. In other words, supporting an individual liberty doesn't mean supporting a subsidy. But I also think it's important to recognize that a right or a freedom isn't meaningful if only people with sufficient financial resources can actually exercise it. In some circumstances, government assistance might be necessary to ensure that an individual right is genuinely available to all, rather than merely available in theory. So I think with any issue, both perspectives deserve to be considered. Fiscal responsibility doesn't automatically mean a lack of compassion, just as believing the government should help provide access to something doesn't automatically mean fiscal irresponsibility. Milton Friedman, one of the most influential free market economists of the 20th century, supported a negative income tax, which is a form of government assistance to people with very low incomes. The core thought process behind it was to alleviate poverty while preserving the incentive to work and reducing government bureaucracy. Friedman wasn't abandoning his free market philosophy. He was applying principles of simplicity and efficiency to a problem that liberals also want to address. John Stuart Mill is generally associated with liberalism, individual liberty, and progressive social thought. Yet he was skeptical of government intervention that would unnecessarily substitute government judgment for individual judgment. Quoting Mill, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others." Mill is essentially establishing a boundary around government authority. Again, the point isn't that Mill was secretly conservative. The point is that liberal thought itself contains ideas about individual responsibility and the limits of government. If people like Milton Friedman and John Stuart Mill can arrive at ideas that don't fit neatly into political boxes, perhaps the boxes aren't as useful as we sometimes think. As humanists, we can care deeply about people's well-being and still ask whether a particular government program is effective, affordable, sustainable, and fair to the people who ultimately must pay for it. The humanist approach, as I see it, is to examine each question independently. What are the facts? What are the consequences? What best promotes human well-being? What responsibility belongs to the individual? And what responsibility belongs to society or the government? And perhaps more importantly, am I applying the same principles consistently, even when they lead me somewhere politically inconvenient? This is where I think humanism can make an important contribution to the political discussion. The Humanist Manifesto and the 10 Commitments don't require us to be liberal or conservative. They don't tell us exactly where the government should begin and end. What they encourage is intellectual independence, respect for human dignity, compassion, reason, evidence, and a willingness to think critically. So perhaps being fiscally conservative and socially liberal isn't really a contradiction at all. Perhaps it's simply a refusal to accept the idea that our values have to come in prepackaged political bundles. Humanism doesn't require us to be politically consistent with a particular ideology. It asks us to be intellectually consistent with our principles. And that, I think, is a pretty good place to begin today's discussions, and so I'll yield the floor.